Well, hello, my friend, and welcome to episode 32. It's Catching Your Breath, the podcast, and I'm Steve Austin. So glad that you are here for another week and another really important discussion. Before we get into this week's discussion, I want to make sure that you saw my latest article, an opinion piece for USA Today. Just came out this past Sunday about how churches should look more like psych wards. I will put the link to that article in the show notes. So if you go to the catchingyourbreath.podbean, or if you look it up on Apple Podcasts, the link will be right there to that USA Today article. I'd love for you to read it and share it. Share it with your pastor, and really consider how your church might look more like a psych ward. Cool? Look, I'm so glad you're here. So many new friends on the blog and the podcast as a result of some new work that I have been doing and really expanding my audience. And I'm just so glad that you're here. If you're new around here and you're wondering who I am, I'll tell you a little bit about me. I was a pastor when I nearly died by suicide at the age of 29. It's been 7 years ago now, just this month. And since recovering from a suicide attempt, I've really begun to see God more clearly. I've become to understand the kind, compassionate, patient nature of a God who is present with us in our suffering. God who is a very present help in time of need, the Bible says. A God who says that He's with us even if we make our bed in hell. Psalm says, even if I make my bed in hell, you are there. And so I'm finding my hope there. In a God who doesn't shy away from hard conversations or difficult questions. A God who also frustrates the heck out of us because sometimes we don't get that immediate miraculous healing that we want. Sometimes we suffer for years and we're tempted to say, if you're so great and powerful, why the heck didn't you heal me? I can't answer that for you. I think that's part of the mystery. But I have come to know God as goodness and mercy and presence in the middle of very difficult times. So I'm from Birmingham, Alabama. My wife Lindsay and I have been married 12 years. Our little boy just turned 8 last week, and our daughter is 5, going on 35. She's the sassiest little thing you've ever seen and a constant source of entertainment. And I am just so fortunate to be here and get to host this podcast, to share on my blog at catchingyourbreath.com. I also do coaching for people who are ready to heal their image of God, and in doing so, heal their image of themselves. I serve as a life coach and a spiritual companion of sorts, and it is just one of the greatest joys of my life. I also do consulting for churches that are looking to better approach the subject of mental health, to better care for and serve members of their congregation and their community who live with mental illness. Maybe you're a pastor or you're on staff and you go, boy, we see this problem. We see the statistics. We see pastors dying by suicide and we want to help, but we don't really know where to start. We don't want to say the wrong thing. We're exhausted and we're also ill-prepared, and what do we do? So I get to come in and help, do an assessment. We create a clear vision, and then we set up a strategy, and then we put that strategy into place and create a system that is self-sustaining. And how do we actually do this in real life? And that includes some on-site visits and some coaching, and it's just such a gift to be able to give back to the church in this way, rather than complaining and poking holes and saying, oh, look at all the ways the church isn't doing their job. Well, how can I help fix that? So that's what I get to do. If you're interested in that, you can check all of it out at catchingyourbreath.com. Look, today we're talking about shame. And maybe you're tempted to say, wait, Steve, you're the faith and mental health guy. Why are you talking about shame? Well, here's what I've learned in the last 7 years since recovering from the deepest, darkest, most painful moments of my life. Do I live with depression? Yes. Do I live with anxiety? Yes. Do I have PTSD? Yes. but it is the shame surrounding all those things, plus childhood sexual abuse. It's the shame of all that nearly killed me. And so I think it's very important that we talk about shame. So today we're going to talk about understanding shame and why you feel it. We're going to talk about how shame is affecting your life. We are going to talk about getting real and how to share your shame with other people. I think that's really important. We are going to talk about letting go of shame-filled thoughts. And then finally, I'm going to share some resources with you, some sort of healing from shame resources that I think can really help you along this journey. So let's dive into this content. I'm so glad you're here. Take a deep breath, buckle up, and let's do this thing. So, before we can really do the deep dive into healing from shame, I think you first have to understand what it is we're talking about. What is shame, and why do you feel it? So I'm going to tell you a little story. Jane had been dating Brad. They'd been dating for a few months. She'd been over to his apartment. She'd met his friends, and they went out to brunch with his parents. She loved how open Brad was, and how open he was with his family, how willingly he shared his life with her. But as time went on, Brad started to find it odd that Jane never asked him into her apartment. She didn't ask him to meet her family or ask him to attend work events with her. Now, Brad was really serious about this girl. He was ready to take it to the next step. But whenever he tried to peer a little bit further into his girlfriend's life, she shut him out. And so finally, Brad gives Jane this sort of ultimatum. He wanted in her life, or he was ready to walk away. And to his surprise, his girlfriend started seeing a therapist. She started working through her issues, and eventually she invited Brad to one of those sessions. And while he was there with her, Jane tearfully shared that her father was a hoarder with a serious shopping addiction. She didn't realize that other kids didn't live surrounded by garbage until she'd visited a friend in second grade. And that was the day that shame became her constant companion. So what is shame? Shame is a difficult emotion to express. Maybe you experience it as this feeling of not being good enough. You might have this worry that there's something wrong with you, or this overwhelming feeling that you're bad, that you're dirty, that you're inferior, that you're less than. So shame and guilt are different. Guilt can be a healthy emotion. It's this emotion that you experience when you do or say something that doesn't live up to your sort of inner moral code, or when you don't meet society's expectations. So, for example, if you sped to work today, maybe you felt guilt over that. Well, guilt is helpful in that it often prompts us to correct bad behavior. So, back to shame. What causes shame? Well, shame is the result of a flawed self-perception. So, back to the story about Jane and Brad. Because of her childhood, Jane saw herself as worthless. She believed that because her father didn't care enough to provide a clean, comfortable home, then it must have been because Jane wasn't worth the effort. Are you tracking with me? So, like Jane, some people experience shame because of a difficult childhood, and that childhood was filled with abuse, or it was filled with neglect. Other people feel shame because an abusive partner blames them when things go wrong. And then other people encounter shame as a result of alcoholism or drug use or overeating. So what should you do about shame? Well, if you feel shame, you might feel tempted to numb those feelings by turning to some sort of substance abuse. But emotional eating, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, it won't stop those feelings. It won't take away your shame. And in fact, oftentimes, it increases your feelings of shame. So for some people, shame tempts them to humiliate other people as a form of revenge. For example, maybe you return home and you yell at your now elderly father for his abuse, or you take out your rage on your boyfriend. But those behaviors won't stop your shame. So if you want to live free, you have to unpack your shame. You have to examine your shame. You have to discover the source of your shame. And once you know that, once you dig down deep and find out what's going on underneath the surface, then you can start to release that shame. You can start to release those negative emotions so that you can experience healing, so that you can find that inner peace that you have been craving all this time and just weren't quite able to identify. So I've got a workbook that I'm going to include a link to in the show notes, again, at catchingyourbreath.podbean.com, or if you look up Catching Your Breath Podcast on Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen, in the show notes, there's going to be a link to download my shame workbook. So go do it. It's free, and you can get it like right now. All right, the second part of this conversation. So we've looked at just the basics of what shame is and how it feels. Now it's time to look at how shame is affecting your life. So shame can influence your life in a really big way. And the reason is shame brings with it this idea that you're unworthy. So when you have this false belief, this flawed self-perception, that can lead you to hide. It can lead you to hide from other people. It can even lead you to hide from yourself. So I want to give you 3 ways that your shame might be affecting you more than you realize. And these are from my own personal experience. The first one is saying yes to everyone. So Paula was known as the go-to person at the company she worked for. She was the art director, but oftentimes she helped out in other departments because she always said yes to her coworkers. But what people didn't realize is that Paula had spent years struggling with self-esteem, believing she was dumb. As a child, she'd struggled with an undiagnosed learning disorder that caused others to characterize her as stupid and lazy. A kind coworker recognized Paula's struggles and recommended that she be tested for a learning disorder. When she received an official diagnosis, Paula cried. She'd spent years feeling ashamed that she couldn't do tasks that came so easy for other people. The second thing you might do is numb the pain. So Levi was a construction worker. He was a devoted father. He attended all of his children's games and events. He loved his wife with all his heart. He supported her through several different career transitions. But what Levi hadn't told anyone was that his uncle had sexually abused him when he was just a little boy. The memories could be triggered by something small like a familiar smell or a certain time of day. Levi hated feeling powerless and ashamed, so he drank to numb the pain. Eventually, he reached the point where he depended on alcohol just to make it through the day. A friend recognized Levi's drinking habits had changed. He encouraged him to seek help from the local chapter of Alcoholics Anonymous. And as Levi dealt with his drinking problem, he also found a mental health professional, a therapist, who helped him heal from this past trauma. The third way that shame might be showing up in your life is wearing a mask. So let's look at Shannon's story. Shannon worked really hard to create the idea that everything in her life was going well. She never left the house without looking runway ready. She paid for her kids to attend the best private school in the area and filled their hours with extracurricular activities. She was in charge of several committees, leading a study group at her church, and she always participated in her children's school activities. Yet, she felt something was wrong, off. She made an appointment with her therapist. While she was there, Shannon shared that she felt deeply unworthy. And this feeling led her to create this facade of the perfect life. Do you know anyone like this? The more Shannon talked with the counselor, the more she realized that her feeling of shame was rooted from her childhood. So her mother had been very verbally abusive. She criticized Shannon all the time. She often told Shannon how much easier life would have been if she just abandoned Shannon when she was born. Now, fortunately, Shannon was able to work through those feelings with her counselor. The more she focused on letting go of the shame, the easier it became to let go of her need to be perfect in every area of her life. So while shame can feel absolutely paralyzing at times, it doesn't mean that you have to live with it forever. With time, with some resources, with a strong support system, with the help of mental health professionals, you can heal your heart and move forward living a shame-free life filled with beauty, filled with joy, filled with peace, filled with true connection and authenticity. In this next little section, we're going to talk about how sharing your shame can set you free. And I want to remind you, go to the show notes, click the link, download the workbook. It's free. All right. In this third part of the episode, we're going to talk about getting real. I want to share with you about how sharing your shame with other people can begin to heal you. So, when most people experience shame, they want to hide. It's very normal to want to isolate yourself when you're feeling shame. And even though it's a really common feeling, that doesn't make it the best choice. So a better option is to let out your shame. I talk about in Catching Your Breath, get naked. So when you share your story with other people, you begin to experience freedom. You begin to experience healing in your life. So how do you do that? I'm going to give you a few ways to share your shame with other people. The first one is to reach out. So, talk to you about Anna. Anna struggled with deep shame from the abuse she experienced in her childhood. She was afraid to tell anyone about what went on in her home behind closed doors. She was afraid that someone would validate her fear that it was all her fault. But one night, she reached out. She picked up the phone and she called her best friend, and she started to share about the pain from her childhood. She was very quickly surprised by just how much better she felt just from talking about it. She didn't realize how much of this shame she was carrying around like this heavy trench coat, the pockets filled with rocks in the middle of the summer. The other thing that just blew Anna away is the way that her friend handled the conversation. She told Anna, "Oh my gosh, you're so brave just to have survived this." She reminded her that her identity didn't stem from the abuse. "You're so much more than your past," Anna's friend told her. It reminds me of Lindsay and I as she drove me home from the psych ward, and we got home and we sat down on the couch, and she said she was going to stay. She said, "If you will tell the truth, if you will ask for help, if you will go to therapy, I will stay, because the worst day of your life doesn't get to define the rest of your life unless you let it." So that's the next part of this getting real, is to pick a kind listener. So maybe your story is like Anna, and you've been carrying around this burden of shame for months, maybe for years, maybe for decades. I want you to know that you don't have to bear that pain all by yourself. So look for someone compassionate that you can talk to. Then you choose that person and you disclose your shame carefully, little by little. You want a kind listener who is compassionate. Can I say compassionate one more time? But you want someone that you trust not to tell your secrets to anyone else. You want someone that you trust not to treat you any differently afterward. So pick someone who's kind and trustworthy. And then the third part of getting real is just to share your heart. So when you're ready to have that conversation with your friend, find a comfortable space. Pick a location that makes you feel safe. Maybe it's the back row, the back pew at church. Maybe it's a tiny little cafe where you can go get coffee. Maybe it's sitting in your car where no one else will hear. Maybe it's in your living room and it's just the two of you at the house. Pick somewhere that makes you feel safe. If you're really struggling with how to put it into words, how do I even begin to share this? Let me give you a few questions to think about. Number one, what event, what conversation caused you to feel shame? How did that moment make you feel? How does it make you feel now? What message or messages have you carried around because of that moment? How does that message affect your life today? Think through those. Maybe write down your responses. That's okay. You might want to ask your friend to let you tell your story without interruption, and then let them ask questions. So that can give you the space that you need to be vulnerable, to take your time to process what happened. And then when you're done, give your friend a chance to respond without interrupting her. So listen to what she's really saying. Allow her compassion to become your companion. Look, I get it. Sharing your shame is scary as hell. It's not easy. It can be so frightening, but it is also freeing. So when someone else knows about your pain, you don't have to carry it all by yourself anymore. You're not alone. And now you have someone to walk with you on your journey toward healing. Remember, free workbook in the show notes. Catching Your Breath on Apple Podcasts, catchingyourbreath.podbean.com. Free workbook. Click the link, download it. All right, the fourth part of this episode, we're going to talk about letting go of those shame-filled thoughts. So we've defined what shame is. We've talked about how it can impact your life. I've told you how you might share it. But even after you share that shame story, sometimes those thoughts can feel so overpowering. So when you find yourself thinking unkind thoughts about yourself, about other people, when things go wrong, maybe you're tempted to think, of course this happened. I don't deserve good things. Or why would anyone like me? I'm pathetic. I'm a loser. I'm a wannabe. If thoughts like those are constantly playing in your head, I want to give you 3 things that you should know about your thoughts. First one is this: your thoughts aren't always true. So some people make the mistake of believing every thought that they have. So if they think, I'm fat, then they accept that the thought is automatically correct. But think about this. For centuries, people believed that the earth was flat. And it was this false belief, this untrue thought, and we passed it around for generations, for centuries. So you might very well have thought patterns that were passed down from generation to generation. Maybe you think things like, I'm destined to be a loser. Or everyone in my family is a loser and I'm going to be too. Or good things don't happen to people like us. I want to challenge you to spend the next week observing your thoughts. So you don't have to just call them out as right or wrong. Just observe them. Just listen to your thoughts. Pay attention to your thoughts. Pay a special attention to the ones that bring you shame. If they make you feel poorly about yourself, pay attention to those thoughts. Second thing about your thoughts, you can change your thoughts. So it's not easy. Changing your thoughts usually takes a long time before you even begin to feel like you're making any kind of progress. But think of changing your thoughts like learning a new language, because that's exactly what it is. It's the language of self-compassion. So think about how you might approach learning a new language. So maybe you don't know, but I'm a sign language interpreter. So part of my work, about 50% of my work, is as an interpreter. And I have been signing since I was 12. So we're talking 25 years. Okay. So a lot of people think, oh, I'm going to pick up that book and in a month I'm going to be having a conversation with somebody. Well, maybe you will, but you probably won't. It's going to take months. It might take years. You're probably going to buy books. You're probably going to talk about it with your friends. You might watch videos on YouTube. You might find a mentor, right? A language mentor, so that you can really learn the language. You're going to surround yourself with people who have this kind of language. Well, it's the same thing with learning the language of kindness, of self-compassion, of acceptance, of grace. You're going to buy books about it. You're going to talk about it with your friends. You might find a mentor, and a mentor might look like a coach or a therapist, a pastor, but you're going to talk about these things with other people so that you replace that old language with the new language. Don't get me fired up, friends. All right. The other thing I want to tell you is that you can learn to love yourself. You can learn to love yourself. So of all the subjects that you were taught in school, maybe in college, you probably had not one class on how to love yourself. But it's one of the most important things you can do in life. You know, I wrote a whole book about self-care for the wounded soul. Well, so much of self-care is self-love. So when you're living deep in shame, I told you before, your perception of yourself gets really jacked up. So you might believe that you're worthless or damaged or ugly. But here's the truth. You are a masterpiece. You are beautiful. You have been woven together by a God who cares so deeply about you and the way that you think about yourself, the way you talk about yourself, the way you talk to yourself. So one simple way to really start practicing self-love is to repeat positive affirmations. I have 31 positive affirmations in the shop. If you go to catchingyourbreath.com and you click on the shop, there's 31 affirmations you can purchase and download really easily. But say affirmations to yourself again and again. The more that you speak those positive affirmations, the more that you begin to believe them. So, here's a few. I am worthy of safety, love, and belonging. I release my past. It has no power over me. I let go of the anger and hurt I've been carrying around. I choose to practice self-compassion. I accept myself fully and completely. Those are just a few affirmations you can repeat over and over and over. I am worthy of safety, love, and belonging. I am worthy of safety, love, and belonging. I am worthy of safety, love, and belonging. And tell it to yourself until you begin to believe it. You have to start to embrace loving thoughts toward yourself. And remember to take it a day at a time. It's not going to feel natural at first. It's sort of like riding a bike with training wheels, or learning to walk for the first time, or again, learning a new language. But as time goes on, you're going to find that it feels easier to shift your thoughts away from shame and toward self-compassion. Look, go to the show notes. We're done here. Go to the show notes, catchingyourbreath.podbean.com or Catching Your Breath on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Go to the show notes, download the free worksheet, and I'm also going to list several resources, and I'm going to put the links there. So, Healing the Shame That Binds You by John Bradshaw. I Thought It Was Just Me, But It Isn't by Brene Brown. The Soul of Shame, Retelling the Stories We Believe About Ourselves by Kurt Thompson. Living with Your Heart Wide Open by Steve Flowers and Bob Stahl. I'm going to put the links and a little short description of each one of those in the show notes there on the website. So go check it out. Thank you for listening. I'll be back next week. Please share this podcast with your friends. Please go to iTunes and leave a 5-star rating and review. It helps so much. And if you want to continue this conversation, you can go to patreon.com/I am Steve Austin. So it's patreon.com/I am Steve Austin. $1 a month, you get put into the Catching Your Breath community on Facebook. I'm about to start at least monthly calls, Zoom calls, where we come together and just talk and share and vent and support one another. It's not counseling, it's not coaching, it's community. So if you're interested in that, patreon.com/I am Steve Austin. And most of all, please take care of yourself. Your life, your story, your healing matters, and it matters to me. Thanks for listening.